I want to tell you what I saw. Not what the Hunt Council's final report says I saw. That document is a bureaucratic mercy, a kind fiction written by administrators who were not there, and who needed the outcome to make sense inside the doctrine they had built their careers upon. I want to tell you what actually happened on Keth Ural, in the observation post above the Sheln Basin, across 14 years and 22 minutes. My name is Sarath Vin of the Vael 6th Observational Clade. I was 23 seasons old when they assigned me to the Human Watch program. I am 37 now, and I have not spoken publicly since I filed my report, and most of what I filed was incomplete, because there are things that do not translate into the forms the Hunt Council provides, and there are things I am still not certain I understand. And there is one thing I understand perfectly and have been unable to say aloud until now. We were wrong about everything. I do not mean we were wrong in the small ways that field observers are routinely wrong about a target's patrol timing, wrong about their sensor range, wrong about the grade of their hull plating. I mean we were wrong in the foundational way, the way that breaks the instrument rather than merely the measurement. We looked at humanity for 14 years through the most sophisticated observational apparatus the Vael pursuit clans had ever deployed, and we saw exactly what we expected to see, and what we expected to see was not there. What was there was something we did not have a category for. What was there had been watching us back from the first hour of the first day, and it had simply been waiting, with a patience I still find difficult to attribute to a biological species, waiting to see if we would ever become worth responding to. We were not in the end, not most of us. Let me start at the beginning. The Vael pursuit clans have been the apex predator civilization of the Sheln cluster for 11,000 years. That is not pride speaking, it is the plain record. We did not achieve dominance through numbers, or through the early discovery of energy weaponry, or through political alliance. We achieved it through the only method that has ever produced durable apex status in this or any other cluster. We watch first. We study. We learn the prey completely before we move. The Hunt Doctrine, the foundational philosophy of our civilization, the thing that separates us from the opportunistic predators that rose and fell in the cluster's early history, holds that no target is engaged until the watcher knows it better than it knows itself, not its patrol routes and sensor ranges, not its weapons and hull grades. Those are the surfaces. The Hunt Doctrine demands that we know the deep structure, the behavioral logic, the social organization, the decision hierarchy, the psychological architecture that produces the behavior we observe. We learn the thing beneath the thing. Only then do we move. We had never been wrong. In 11,000 years of expansion, incorporating 47 species, dissolving 19 separate civilizations into the clan's administrative structure, the Hunt Doctrine had never produced a failed engagement. 47 for 47. The record was not luck. The record was method. The record was the result of generations of Vael observers sitting in buried posts and deep shadow stations and drifting passive arrays, watching, recording, building the picture, until the picture was complete enough that the outcome of the engagement was already determined before the first ship moved. We did not go to war. We went to the conclusion of a study. The war was a formality. When the long-range detection arrays first flagged the human signals, electromagnetic, gravitational, the distinctive signature of early-grade faster-than-light transit, the Hunt Council convened within the standard rotation and assigned the 6th Observational Clade to the Watch program. Standard protocol. We were given a 14-year observational mandate, which was generous by historical standards, but appropriate given the human's apparent technological level and the cluster distance involved. The Council wanted a thorough read. They always want a thorough read, because the doctrine demands thoroughness, and the doctrine is what 47 successful engagements are built on, and no one on the Council had any reason to believe the 48th would be different. I joined the clade at the beginning of the 3rd year. My posting was the observation post on Keth Ural, the innermost moon of the gas giant Keth Shora, which sits at the edge of what the humans call their outer transit corridor. The post had been established by my predecessor, a senior observer named Vael, who had spent 2 years building the passive sensor network and had left an archive of initial observations that I spent my first month absorbing. Vael was a careful observer. The archive was methodical, dense, cross-referenced. He had catalogued the human ships in the corridor with the precision our training demands. Hull dimensions, drive signatures, transit patterns, crew rotation schedules inferred from communication traffic analysis. His notation was clean, and his conclusions were organized in the manner of a senior observer who had done this many times before and knew which threads to pull and which to set aside. His conclusions at the end of the 2-year initial report were confident. The humans, he wrote, were a young civilization at an adolescent technological stage. Their faster-than-light capability was functional but crude, low precision, high energy cost, limited range. Their warships were large, which was consistent with civilizations that had not yet learned that mass is a liability in high-speed engagement, and they were slow, which confirmed the hypothesis. Their sensor range was moderate. Their communication encryption was sophisticated relative to their other technologies, which Vael flagged as an interesting asymmetry, though he concluded it was likely a product of their political structure, multiple competing factions, internal secrets, the kind of encryption culture you develop when you do not trust your own kind, rather than any awareness of external surveillance. They did not appear to know they were being watched. Their behavior showed no signs of the altered patrol patterns, the communication discipline shifts, the subtle navigational adjustments that are the hallmarks of a species that has detected an observer and is managing the information. That conclusion was in the file when I arrived. I read it, accepted it as the foundation, and began building on it. For 11 years, I built on it. I want to be honest about what that means because I think the honesty matters for what comes later. Building on a foundation is not the same as examining the foundation. You do not, when you are 23 seasons old and newly assigned to your first long watch posting, question the 2-year archive left by a senior observer with a clean record and rigorous methodology. You read it. You accept what is useful. You begin adding to it. Vael had established that the humans were an adolescent species at a particular technological level, unaware of external surveillance, following predictable behavioral patterns. I accepted this the way you accept the grammar of a language before you learn to speak it, as the framework inside which the work happens, not as the work itself. Over 11 years, I added several 100,000 data points to the archive. Every one of them was filtered through that framework. Every anomaly I noticed was interpreted within that framework's logic. I was extremely good at what I was doing, and what I was doing was wrong, and I did not know it was wrong for 11 years, and this is something I have had to sit with. I should tell you what the observation post was like, because the physical reality of it shaped everything, and because I want you to understand what 14 years of this work does to a person's sense of what is normal. The post was a buried facility. Most of Keth Ural's surface is fused silicate, the result of an ancient geological event that had essentially baked the moon's crust into a continuous ceramic plate, which was excellent for our purposes because it provided natural thermal shielding, and the passive sensor arrays could be sunk into it without leaving any surface signature. The post itself was approximately 60 meters below the surface, accessible through 3 angled shafts, with a living area, a data processing center, and the observation deck, which was not an actual deck with windows, but a chamber full of screens and haptic interfaces connected to the sensor network embedded in the silicate above. I lived there mostly alone for 11 years. There were rotations every 400 days, A supply vessel would arrive through the Kethshora gas giant's transit shadow, where the human sensors could not reach it, and I would exchange personnel reports and updated data packages, and occasionally a junior observer who would stay for 100 days before rotating out. But the work was fundamentally solitary. That is the nature of the long watch. You sit with the data. You learn the pattern. You let the pattern become your reality. I ate my meals at the data processing terminal. I slept in a bunk 4 meters from the observation chamber. I exercised in a narrow corridor because the post had not been designed with comfort in mind, only with function. The only window I had on the external world was the sensor network, and the only world the sensor network showed me was the outer transit corridor and the ships that moved through it. In this way, I came to know those ships the way you come to know anything you live with for years. The pattern over 11 years was consistent. The human ships in the outer transit corridor followed predictable schedules. The large warships, the ones Vael had catalogued as their primary military class, transited the corridor on a cycle of approximately 220 days. There were 7 of them that used this corridor regularly, and I had named them in my personal notation system by their drive signatures, because the humans used a naming convention I could not parse orally and my transliteration algorithms were, at that point, still imprecise. I called them by their drive colors: amber, cyan, double cyan, 3-point, rust, cold amber, and the one I called the dark one. The dark one was different from the first day I noticed it. Most of the corridor traffic was what my training had prepared me for. Ships moving with purpose, following routes, communicating on predictable frequencies, behaving in ways that composed into readable behavioral logic. Patrol, transit, escort. The signatures of a young civilization managing its space with the organized, but still somewhat improvised quality of a species that has not been doing this long enough to have made all the patterns unconscious. I could read the corridor traffic the way a naturalist reads a familiar ecosystem. Not perfectly, not without gaps, but with the confidence that comes from years of accumulated pattern recognition. The human transit culture had the texture of something still being worked out. The communication bursts arrived at slightly irregular intervals, as though the schedule was policy rather than reflex. The patrol patterns had a bureaucratic quality. I could see, in the timing and the route overlaps, the decisions of a planning process that was competent but not yet intuitive. The way the vessels handled unexpected gravitational variables in the corridor. The gas giant's resonance effects on the inner transit lanes, which produced predictable but significant navigation challenges, was efficient but deliberate. The difference between solving a problem and having already solved it and no longer needing to think about it. I found the humans interesting in the way you find any complex subject interesting when you spend enough time with them. Not admirable, exactly. The Hunt doctrine is careful about the distinction between understanding a subject and developing sentiment about them, because sentiment corrupts analysis, but engaging. There was something in the data I could not quite reduce to the standard categories. The dark one did not fit the pattern. It was the largest of the 7 warships, significantly larger, in fact. My measurements across the 11 years gave it a consistent hull length of approximately 5,800 meters, which was substantially longer than anything else in the corridor, and longer than anything in the historical archive of human vessel assessments that the Clades main station had provided as reference material. The hull itself returned a different sensor profile than the others. Denser, the materials registering as more complex alloys, the surface temperature differential indicating either heavier insulation or active thermal management of a kind I had not seen in the other vessels. The hull surface was more heavily marked, scoring, thermal staining, discoloration across broad sections, the unmistakable patina of a ship that had been operated in harsh conditions for a very long time. It was not the kind of weathering you see on a vessel that has been worked hard and maintained poorly. It was the kind of weathering you see on something very old. It moved slowly in absolute terms, but the drive signature was distinctive. When I ran spectral analysis on the wake patterns, the energy output was inconsistent with the apparent mass. The dark one was either much lighter than it looked, which the materials analysis contradicted, or it was operating its drives at a small fraction of their capacity. It was, in other words, not going fast because it was not trying to go fast. I noted this in my reports. The Clade's lead analyst, reviewing from the main station 2 light-years away, flagged my notation and suggested the drive underperformance was likely a maintenance artifact, older vessel, degraded drive coils, the kind of systemic inefficiency that accumulates in a ship that has been in service for a long time. The hull weathering supported this reading. The Dark One's surface profile was consistent with a vessel decades old, possibly more. An old ship. A slow old ship, doing its route on the schedule that had been assigned to it, carrying out its duties at the pace its degraded systems allowed. I accepted this, I logged it, I kept watching. The other thing about the Dark One was its communication signature. Every ship in the corridor communicated. The humans were, I had learned over the years, a highly communicative species. They maintained near constant contact with their home stations. They exchanged navigation data. They transmitted what my analysis suggested were personal communications between crew and family alongside the operational traffic. There was a texture to the human communication pattern that I found, after years of observation, recognizable in the way that any characteristic behavior becomes recognizable. The rhythm of check-ins, the clustering of traffic around certain times in the human day cycle, the occasional long burst transmission that my algorithm suggested was high data density, possibly entertainment or crew welfare content. The communication pattern was, in aggregate, extremely dense. A Vael vessel of equivalent size would generate approximately 1/10 the signal traffic, because Vael military culture values communication discipline and the reduction of exploitable signal. The humans did not appear to have developed this discipline. They talked. They talked a great deal. The Dark One generated almost none. Not zero. I want to be precise here, because precision is what I was trained for, and because the imprecision in my early analysis is something I have examined many times since. The Dark One was not completely silent. There was a carrier signal, a constant low-frequency pulse that my algorithms classified as an automated positioning beacon, the kind of passive identifier that human vessels use to log their location in the transit network. And there was, periodically, a brief encrypted burst that the analysis tools classified as a standard operational report, crew status, mechanical condition, the routine check in that military vessels make to their command structures. Brief, minimal, precisely what you would expect from a vessel running quiet. No personal traffic, no navigation exchange beyond the minimum, no high data density entertainment bursts. I did not find this alarming. I found it consistent. An older vessel, slower, running economically. A crew that had been at their posting long enough to have reduced their communication habits to the professional minimum, the way any experienced crew reduces unnecessary noise. I had by that point been at my own posting for 11 years. I understood the discipline of the long quiet. The Dark One's crew, I thought, were simply professionals. They had been doing their route for a long time, and they had learned to do it with the minimum necessary expenditure of everything, including words. I wrote about them in my personal log, not the official reports, my own observations, which I kept as a practice to maintain my analytic edge, a habit my first supervisor had encouraged as a way of keeping the observational faculty fresh when the data is routine. I wrote that the Dark One's crew impressed me in the abstract. Their patience, their economy. The way the ship moved with a kind of deliberate restraint that felt, when I watched it long enough, almost like a philosophical position rather than a mechanical limitation. Other ships in the corridor moved with the slightly improvised energy of vessels that were busy, that had schedules, that were managing competing demands. The Dark One moved as though it had nowhere particular to be and no deadline it was concerned about. And this quality, which I had attributed to old machinery and a veteran crew, produced, in the aggregate of years of watching it, a sense of something I did not have a precise professional term for. I wrote at the end of the 9th year, "The Dark One has been in this corridor for as long as we have been watching it. I wonder sometimes if it is as tired of the route as I am of watching it." I have reread that entry many times. The thing I find most remarkable about it now is how close it was to the truth, and how completely I failed to understand what I was seeing. In the 12th year, the Hunt Council convened the pre-engagement review. The standard process. The 6th Clade's complete 14-year archive would be transmitted to the Council's analytical division, where the senior Hunt planners would process the data and build the engagement model. The engagement model would specify the force required, the timing, the approach vectors, the priority targets, the expected duration. The Council would approve the model, the force would be assembled, and the engagement would proceed. It was a process that had been executed 47 times, and the analytical division had refined it across those engagements into something very close to a science. They knew how to read an archive. They knew how to weight different categories of data. They knew how to build a model that accounted for uncertainty and still produced a reliable outcome. I attended the review via long-range transmission, which added a communication lag to every exchange. The lead Hunt planner, a senior officer named Keth Varas, who had personally managed the analytical reviews for 11 previous engagements, had reviewed my 11 years of data and had questions. "Observer Sarath Vin," Keth Varas said, "your reports note a persistent anomaly in the drive signature of Vessel 7, the one you've designated the Dark One in your personal notation. Can you characterize the anomaly for the Council?" I explained what I had observed: the underperformance relative to apparent drive capacity, the hull mass and materials inconsistency, the low communication signature. My conclusion: maintenance artifact, old vessel, experienced crew operating at minimum necessary output. "Have you considered," Keth Varas said, after the lag, "that the vessel might be operating at reduced output deliberately?" "Yes," I said. "I considered it in the early years and concluded the behavioral pattern was inconsistent with a deliberate concealment posture. A vessel actively hiding would not maintain a positioning beacon. A crew actively running silent would not file operational reports on standard cycles. They are not hiding. Their behavior is consistent with a vessel that has nothing to hide and is simply operating conservatively." "Agreed," Keth Varas said. "Old ship, experienced crew. We'll designate it as a tertiary target, lower assessed capacity, lower priority. Thank you, Observer." The engagement model that came back from the Council's analytical division 300 days later designated the Dark One as tertiary target 7. The force assembled was 6,000 pursuit vessels, standard overwhelming ratio for a civilization of this assessed capability, calibrated against the 47-case historical archive to ensure the outcome was not merely probable but certain. The engagement was projected to take approximately 4 hours from first contact to cessation of organized resistance. Primary targets were the human home stations and the main transit hubs. The warships in the outer corridor, including the 7 I had been watching, were secondary and tertiary. I read the engagement model. I filed my concurrence, the standard procedural step, the field observer's confirmation that the model was consistent with what the archive supported. The model was consistent with what the archive supported. That was the problem, though I did not understand it as a problem yet. The archive was what I had built over 11 years inside a frame I had inherited from Varathsal on the first day of my posting. And the frame had been wrong from the beginning, and the model was consistent with the archive, and the archive was wrong. I began the final observational phase, the pre-engagement watch, which by doctrine runs for 200 days before the force moves. 97 days into the pre-engagement watch, the Dark One changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that triggered any of my alert thresholds, but I had been watching this ship for 11 years, and I knew its rhythms the way you know the rhythms of anything you have observed for that long. The way a naturalist knows the breathing pattern of an animal they have been watching for seasons. The way you know, without checking, when something is different and something was different. The drive signature shifted, not a large shift, not the kind of change that the automated systems flagged as significant. But the spectral balance in the wake pattern altered by a fraction that, when I plotted it against the 11-year baseline rather than just the previous month's data, was clearly outside the range of normal variation. Something in the drive system had changed. Not broken, the change was too clean for a malfunction, too uniform across the whole drive array. Adjusted. Someone had made a deliberate adjustment to the drive calibration, and the result was a slightly different energy output profile. I pulled up the 10th year's data and ran the comparison, then the 9th year's, then the 8th. The shift was not new. It had been occurring in very small increments for years, fractions of fractions, individually meaningless, but when I collapsed the entire 11-year timeline into a single plot, the trend was unmistakable. The drive output had been climbing, slowly, continuously, over years. The change per day was so small that no individual report had flagged it, because each report compared against the previous report and the change was below threshold. But against the full baseline, the complete picture rather than the local comparison, the Dark One's drive system had been building output for years, and was now operating at a level that, when I ran the extrapolation forward, suggested a drive array being systematically brought from a fraction of its capacity towards something approaching its full rated output. I sat in the observation chamber for a long time. The last of the Vael supply rotations had completed 40 days earlier. There was no one on Keth Ural but me. The 3 access shafts above me led up through 60 meters of fused silicate to a surface that no one was standing on. The sensor network hummed in its housing. The screens showed me the corridor, the ships, the data that I had spent 11 years accumulating, more than 3,000 days of observations, logged with the care and precision the 6th Clade's training demands, checked against the baseline at the report interval, analyzed within the framework Varath Sal had established, filed on schedule without a single missed transmission. I sat with the trend line on the central screen, and I thought about what I knew. There were explanations consistent with my previous model. A gradual maintenance schedule, drive components being brought back online over years, a systematic restoration of capability that had been degraded by age and use. Old ship, being quietly repaired over a long posting, bringing systems back online methodically. The maintenance restoration explanation was coherent. It accounted for the data. It was consistent with the frame. But consistency is not the same as correctness. I had learned, somewhere in 11 years of this work, that the most dangerous readings are the ones that fit too neatly, the ones that the framework accommodates without friction, the ones that do not require you to ask a second question. The maintenance restoration story fit neatly. It had fit neatly for years, which was why no one had asked a second question about it, including me. I transmitted a supplemental observation note to the Clade's lead analyst, flagging the trend. I was careful in how I framed it. I did not say what I was beginning to think, because what I was beginning to think required me to contradict 11 years of filed assessments, and because I was not yet certain, and because certainty is what the doctrine requires before you make a claim that large. I flagged the trend. I asked for the analytical division's review. The response came back on the standard cycle. The analyst agreed it was worth noting, classified it as consistent with a long-duration maintenance restoration program, and suggested it did not materially affect the engagement model. Tertiary Target 7 remained a tertiary target. I filed the note. I kept watching. On the 104th day of the pre-engagement watch, 7 days after I had filed the drive signature note, the Dark One turned. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because the way I perceived it in the moment and the way I understand it now are different, and the difference is important. In the moment, I perceived it as a navigational adjustment, the ship altering its corridor transit vector. Ships do this. Drive signatures fluctuate, navigational corrections occur, the routine adjustments of transit through a corridor with gravitational variables. My alert thresholds did not flag it. The automated systems logged it as a minor vector correction and moved on. What I understand now is that the Dark One turned to face Kethural. Not approximately. Not in the way that a navigational adjustment might incidentally point a ship in a particular direction before subsequent corrections bring it back to course. The vector change was precise, within a fraction of a degree, and the direction it ended up pointing was directly at my moon, the observation post, me. The correction did not continue. The ship settled on the new vector and held it. I did not understand this for 18 hours. What made me understand it in the end was not the vector. It was the communication signature. The minimal, economical, professional communication pattern that I had observed for 11 years, the positioning beacon, the brief operational reports at standard intervals changed. Not by much. Not in a way that the automated analysis systems flagged as anomalous. But I had been watching this ship for 11 years, and I knew its communication rhythms, and something was different. The operational report that filed that day was longer than the standard, by approximately 3%. 3% of a brief encrypted burst is a very small number of additional bits. But when I ran the extended transmission against the historical baseline, the content structure was different. The standard report had a characteristic internal organization. The data would be arranged in a consistent sequence that my pattern analysis tools had mapped over years of observation, a grammar of data structure that I had learned the way you learn any grammar, by exposure rather than by having it explained. The extended report's internal structure was different. The data was arranged differently. The grammar had changed. I could not decrypt it. I want to be clear about that. I could not read what was in the transmission. But I had spent 11 years learning the shape of these reports, and the shape of this one was not what it should have been. I sat very still in the observation chamber. The screens showed me the Dark One's current position, the vector that pointed with geometric precision at the moon I was sitting inside. The drive signature, now running above the baseline I had spent years establishing. One life sign in a buried post. A ship 5,800 meters long, pointed directly at me, that I had classified as a degraded tertiary target. I transmitted an urgent supplemental to the Clade lead analyst. I explained what I had found. I said, "The Dark One is not what we assessed." I said, "The drive output trend is not a maintenance restoration, or if it is a restoration to a capability far above what we attributed to the vessel." I said, "The ship has turned to face this moon with a precision that cannot be navigational coincidence." I said, "I believe we have been observed." The response took 6 days, because the Clade's main station was 2 light-years away, and the urgent channel still required physical relay propagation across the intervening distance. In those 6 days, the Hunt Council moved the force. I did not know this when the analyst's response arrived. I did not know the 6,000 pursuit vessels were already in transit, already committed, already past the point where an urgent supplemental from a field observer could redirect them. The analyst's response was measured and professional, and it said, essentially, that my supplemental raised interesting questions that would be reviewed in the post-engagement debrief, but that the engagement model had already been approved by the full council, and the force was committed and underway. And that field observer anxiety in the pre-engagement phase was a documented phenomenon. There was even a clinical term for it in the Clade's medical literature. A recognized psychological response to the long watch reaching its conclusion, and that I should maintain my observational position and file my final pre-engagement report on schedule. I filed the final report. I maintained my position. There was nothing else I could do. On the 119th day of the pre-engagement watch, 15 days after the Dark One turned, 6 days after the analyst's response, 1 day after I filed my final pre-engagement report, the Hunt Council's 6,000 pursuit vessels dropped out of faster-than-light transit into the outer transit corridor. Standard doctrine for the opening of an engagement. Simultaneous emergence at multiple points, surrounding the target system, cutting off retreat vectors before the enemy has time to organize. 6,000 ships, emerging at 17 designated points around the outer corridor's perimeter, closing in formation toward the primary targets. The sensor package on Keth Ural gave me a perfect view of the whole corridor. 17 years of careful placement and calibration, the most comprehensive passive array the 6th Clade had ever deployed in a single system. I watched the emergent signatures bloom on my screens, 17 bright points, each one the mass shadow of hundreds of vessels dropping into normal space. And for a moment, watching it from inside the moon while the great machinery of Vael doctrine executed itself with 11,000 years of practiced precision, I felt something I am not entirely proud of. I felt pride. We were very good at this. Whatever I had transmitted in my anxious supplementals, whatever unease had been building in me across those 15 days, there was a part of me, the part trained by the 6th observational Clade, the part that had spent 11 years learning this system, that looked at 6,000 pursuit vessels executing a perfect emergence pattern and thought, this is what we are. This is what 47 successful engagements look like from the inside. The force was not beautiful exactly, but there was something in the scale of it, the precision, the way every ship was exactly where the model said it should be, that produced a response I recognized as something like awe. The Dark One fired before the emergent signature had fully resolved. I want you to understand the timing here, because the timing is the thing. The Vael pursuit vessels were still in the process of transitioning from faster-than-light to normal space, a process that takes, for a vessel of standard pursuit class, approximately 3 minutes from the moment the mass shadow appears to the moment the ship is fully materialized and operationally capable. This is a known vulnerability in faster-than-light emergence, one that every spacefaring civilization understands and manages through simultaneous emergence protocols. The idea being that if all your ships emerge at once, the enemy cannot target individual ships during their vulnerable transition phase without exposing themselves to fire from all the others that have already completed transition. It is a sound doctrine. It has worked 47 times. The Dark One, the Cashin Morn. I learned the name later from the post-engagement intelligence analysis, and I will use it now because it was always a named ship with a named crew and a named history, and I should have known that, should have tried harder to know it. The Cashin Morn did not wait for the 3-minute transition window to close. The first salvo reached the first emergence point in 17 seconds. I need to try to explain what 17 seconds means in terms of what I was watching. The first emergence point was approximately 1.3 light seconds from the Cashin Morn's position. The salvo, I could see it on my sensors as a series of high-velocity projectile signatures, and what appeared to be directed energy bursts of a power grade I had never seen attributed to any human vessel, crossed that distance in 17 seconds. Which means the projectiles were traveling at a significant fraction of the speed of light. Which means the drive system I had spent 11 years characterizing as underperforming had been, the entire time, managing energy loads of a magnitude I had never attributed to the whole ship. The weapons I had spent 11 years not seeing because I had concluded there was nothing to see. The weapons platforms that required drive output I had measured and misread and classified as degradation were operating at a scale that my sensors were still processing in a kind of iterative disbelief, recalibrating as each salvo data point arrived and revised the power estimate upward. The first emergence point stopped producing sensor returns approximately 20 seconds after the salvo reached it. Not reduced returns, not damaged vessel returns consistent with ships that had been hit and were still operational. No returns. 312 pursuit vessels in the process of transitioning into normal space were gone from my sensors in 20 seconds. The Cashin Morn turned to the second emergence point and fired while the first salvo was still traveling. I watched this happen. I want to be honest about my state in those moments, because the post-engagement protocols assume that a field observer in an engagement continues to observe, to record, to maintain the professional discipline of documentation. I did maintain the documentation. The recording systems were automated and required no input from me. But I do not think I can accurately describe what I was doing as observing in the professional sense. I was watching. There is a difference. The Cashin Morn moved through the outer corridor with a systematic quality that I have spent the subsequent years trying to find the right word for and have not succeeded. It was not frantic. It was not the explosive, kinetic motion of a vessel fighting for survival. It moved the way, and I know this is an unusual comparison, but it is the one that came to me in the moment and that I have not been able to improve upon. It moved the way a very experienced person moves through a familiar space, executing a task they have done many times, with the economy of motion that comes from knowing exactly what needs to happen next and exactly how to make it happen. Point to point, salvo to salvo, the drive output I had spent 11 years watching was now fully visible in its true character. The Cashin Morn was fast, not fast for a ship of its size, fast in an absolute sense. Faster than anything the Clades analysis had suggested was achievable at that mass, which meant the mass figure was wrong, or the drive technology was categorically different from what we had assessed, or both, and the answer I was understanding in real time was probably both. The second emergence point went silent 7 minutes after the first. The third went silent 11 minutes after the second. I was still taking notes. My hands were moving through habit, labeling timestamps and sector coordinates, noting drive signature values and salvo intervals. The documentation that the post-engagement protocol required was being created. I am not certain that I, the observer behind the hands, was still capable of analysis in the professional sense. I was watching something that my training and my 11 years of careful work had told me was not possible, and the gap between what was in front of me and what I had built was so large that something in the analytic faculty had gone quiet. I was just watching. The fourth emergence point. The fifth. By the fifth point, I had begun to understand what was happening in a way I had not when the first salvo fired. The understanding came in stages. The way understanding always comes when something fundamental in your model of the world is being revised, not as a single realization but as a series of reckonings, each one opening onto the next. First, I understood that the Cashin Morn was a different vessel than I had assessed. Then I understood that the drive signature data I had spent 11 years logging was not what I thought it was, not degraded output, but managed output, output precisely calibrated to read as something it was not. Then I understood that the weapons data I had never seen because I had concluded there was nothing to see was also not what I thought, or rather was something I had never thought, because I had never thought there was anything to think. By the fifth point, I began to understand the last thing. The Cashin Morn had turned to face Keth Ural 15 days before the engagement. 15 days. The Hunt Council's force had moved 12 days ago. I was reconstructing the timeline from the transmission logs, matching the forced departure date against transit times, doing the arithmetic with the methodical precision of someone who needed the arithmetic to say something different than it was saying. The Dark One had turned 3 days before the force moved. Before the force moved. Before there was anything to detect in the normal sense. Faster-than-light transit is, for technical reasons involving the nature of the transit field itself, essentially undetectable to conventional sensors until the moment of emergence. The Cashin Morn had turned and pointed itself at the moon, where the 6th observational clades field post was located 3 days before the force entered transit. Not because it had detected the force, because it had already known the force was coming. I stopped taking notes. The 6th emergence point. The 7th. I was tracking the returns automatically now, the way you track anything when the cognitive overhead of active attention has been displaced by something that requires more of you than attention. The other 6 human warships. I had been so focused on the Cashin Morn that I had not checked the rest of the corridor for the first 17 minutes. When I pulled up the full corridor display, I found that the other 6 ships I had spent 11 years watching were no longer on the transit routes I had logged for them. They were positioned at 6 of the 17 emergence points. They had been there before the Cashin Morn fired the first salvo. They had positioned themselves, without any communication I had detected in the pre-engagement phase, without any coordination visible in the traffic analysis, with no apparent change in their behavior in the days preceding the engagement, at 6 of the 17 points where the Vael pursuit fleet would emerge. They were waiting there, and they were not running away, and the pursuit vessels emerging at those 6 points had emerged into weapons envelopes of ships that were already oriented, already powered, already committed to the targeting solution. 6 ships, no detected coordination, positioned with geometric precision at 6 of 17 emergence points, days in advance. The Hunt Doctrine says, know the prey better than it knows itself. 11,000 years, 47 civilizations, the doctrine had never been wrong. I want to tell you what the experience of that realization was like, because I think it matters, and because the post-engagement medical debriefs and the clinical reports and the Council's formal after-action analysis do not and cannot contain it. The realization was not a single moment. It was a process of assembly, each piece arriving and interlocking with the last, and the picture that assembled was the same picture from a different angle, the same picture I had been looking at for 11 years, now seen correctly for the first time. We had not been the observers, we had been the observed. For 14 years, from before Varathsal built the first sensor array, the pale Armada had been watching. The long watch we had congratulated ourselves on was the surface of a longer watch conducted by people who were, it turned out, considerably more patient and considerably more disciplined than we had assessed them to be, which is to say considerably more patient and disciplined than any subject in our 47-case archive, which is to say something that the Hunt Doctrine had no category for. They had watched us watch them. They had let us gather our data and write our reports and build our model. They had watched us converge on the engagement decision and had known what the engagement model would look like before our analytical division had filed it. And they had positioned their ships at the emergence points that the engagement model specified, because they already knew what the engagement model would specify, because they had studied us long enough to know how we think. At 22 minutes and 14 seconds from the first salvo, the outer transit corridor was quiet. 6,000 pursuit vessels, 22 minutes and 14 seconds. I want to log the arithmetic here, because the post-engagement reports use aggregate numbers and the aggregate obscures the texture. The Cashin Morn engaged 17 emergence points, 312 vessels at the first point. Numbers I would spend weeks reconstructing from the sensor archive in the weeks after, totaling what the Hunt Council would later report as 5,986 pursuit vessels confirmed destroyed or lost coherence on emergence. The remaining 14 had survived, not by fighting back, but because they had emerged at points where neither the Cashin Morn nor the 6 flanking warships had coverage, and they had immediately reversed into faster-than-light transit before the closest human ship could close the distance. 14 of 6,000. The engagement model had projected 4 hours to cessation of organized resistance and 0 Vael losses in the first phase. The model had been wrong by a margin the Hunt Council's after-action analysis would later describe, with considerable understatement, as outside the expected confidence interval. I sat in the observation chamber for what my later review of the timestamp logs tells me was 4 hours and 17 minutes. I do not have a precise memory of those 4 hours. The recording systems were still running. I was not doing anything useful. I was in the chamber my predecessor had built, surrounded by 11 years of careful work, and I was not thinking exactly in the professional sense. I was in the presence of something I had no frame for, and the absence of a frame produces a particular kind of quiet that I had not experienced before. A new sensor return appeared. The Cashin Morn had moved to a position approximately 100,000 kilometers from Keth Ural. I watched it sit there. My hands were still. The recording systems were logging everything. The ship was at 100,000 kilometers, close enough that the sensor return was clear, close enough that the active sensor profile I was receiving was high resolution, close enough that if there were any windows on that hull facing this moon, the crew would be able to see it. 100,000 kilometers is not a navigational position. It is not a transit route position. It is a deliberate position. The Cashin Morn sensors swept Keth Ural. I could detect the sweep because the sensor package I had built over 11 years was sophisticated enough to detect incoming sensor emissions, and the Cashin Morn's active sensors were of a grade I had not attributed to the vessel. Powerful, high resolution, the kind of active system you deploy when you want to know exactly what is in front of you. The sweep was thorough, methodical. It lasted 11 minutes, working across the moon's surface and subsurface in a systematic pattern that made clear the operators knew there was something to find and were looking for it with the patience of people who were accustomed to finding things. It found the post. I knew it had found the post because the sweep intensity increased over the Sheln Basin area and remained elevated for approximately 3 minutes before completing. At that resolution and that power level, the post's thermal signature would have been clear through 60 meters of silicate. One facility, one life sign, one observer sitting in a chamber, watching the ship that was watching them. At the end of the 11 minutes, the Cashin Morn turned away. I cannot tell you with certainty what happened in the space between the end of the sensor sweep and the moment the ship turned away. I cannot tell you what was said on the bridge, or what the decision process looked like, or who spoke and what they concluded. I cannot decrypt the operational report that was transmitted shortly after the sweep concluded, the brief encrypted burst that filed to their command structure, noting, I assume, the result of the sweep and the decision that followed. I can tell you only what I observed. The sweep finished, there was a pause of approximately 4 minutes, and then the Cashin Morn's drive signature shifted and the ship turned onto a new vector and departed. No strike, no approach. No further interaction. The Cashin Morn scanned Keth Ural, found one observer in a buried post, paused for 4 minutes and left. I have thought about those 4 minutes for a long time. I think about the crew on the other side of that assessment, the people who had spent years doing what I had spent years doing, the patience that required, the discipline, the accumulated skill of knowing how to look at something for a long time without letting it know you were looking. I think about the decision they made in those 4 minutes and the logic behind it, and I believe I understand the logic, and the logic is not comforting to me, but I think it is correct. They found me insufficient to warrant the expenditure. Not because I was protected, not because I was non-threatening, not because of any rule of engagement that governed their behavior. Because I was a single observer in a small facility, and the accounting of the engagement had already been completed, and one person in a buried post represented no continuation of the threat that had warranted the response. I was below the threshold. That is the most clarifying and the most humbling thing I have ever understood about what the Pale Armada is. Not that they could do what they did to 6,000 ships in 22 minutes, though that is what the archive will record, and that number will be in every strategic assessment the Vael pursuit clans produce for generations. The most important thing is the threshold, the precision of the assessment. The fact that they had enough data on us, and on me specifically, to know that leaving me alive was not a miscalculation. They had done the study. They knew what I was. They knew what I was worth. I filed my post-engagement report 3 weeks later, when the supply vessel arrived and the communication relays were restored. The report was accurate in its documentation. It was incomplete in its analysis, because there are things that do not fit in the forms the Hunt Council provides, and because I had not yet found language for what I understood, and because some things I understood I was not certain the Council wanted to read. The Hunt Council's after-action review concluded that the engagement had failed due to intelligence assessment error, specifically an incorrect characterization of the target's military capability and a failure to detect active counter-surveillance. Recommendations were made regarding observational methodology. The Hunt Doctrine was preserved in its essential form, on the grounds that the failure was an implementation error rather than a doctrinal failure. This conclusion is the document I mentioned at the beginning, the kind fiction, the frame that makes the outcome legible within the doctrine's logic. I was debriefed twice. I was placed on extended medical leave. I was eventually returned to observational duties in a different cluster, far from the Sheln system, watching a species that is, by all assessments, genuinely at an early technological stage with no apparent awareness of external observation. I have been careful, in my current assignment, to check whether the drive signatures trend upward over time. They do not. But I check. Every day, I run the comparison against the full historical baseline rather than the previous report, and I look at the trend line, and I make sure. Because the thing the Cashin Morn taught me, the thing I have been trying to articulate across all the years since I sat in that chamber and watched 22 minutes in 6,000 ships, is not a lesson about intelligence methodology or the need for broader sensor coverage or the value of checking the full baseline against the short window. Those are the technical lessons, and they are real, and the Sixth Clade has incorporated them into its standard protocols, and they are valuable. The lesson beneath the lesson is different. The Hunt Doctrine says, know the prey better than it knows itself. The doctrine is correct. The doctrine is sound. 11,000 years of successful application do not make a thing wrong when it fails for the first time. What the doctrine does not contain, and what it could not contain without being a different doctrine, is the question of what happens when the prey is not prey. What happens when the thing you are studying is also studying you, and is better at it, and has been doing it longer, and has come to a different conclusion about what the engagement model should look like and how it should be executed, and when it should begin? What happens is 22 minutes. The Pale Armada does not announce itself. It does not warn. It does not negotiate or position or signal its intentions through the diplomatic channels that civilizations at the same tier used to manage their relationships with each other. It watches. It learns. It builds the picture with the patience and the discipline of something that has been doing exactly this for a very long time, and when the picture is complete, and the decision has been made, and the threshold has been crossed, it responds with the same economy it applies to everything else. The minimum necessary, not a ship more than the problem requires, not a minute longer than the engagement needs. We studied the Pale Armada for 14 years. We thought we were the watchers. We thought we were learning the prey. We thought we were building the model that would determine the outcome before the first ship moved. We were the model. I am 37 seasons old. I sit in a buried observation post in a different cluster, watching a different species through a different sensor network, and I do my work with the same care and the same precision the doctrine requires. I run the baseline comparisons. I check the trend lines. I log the drive signatures and the communication patterns and the behavioral rhythms that will, eventually, build into a picture complete enough for the Hunt Council to act on. But I do not assume anymore that the picture I am building is the only picture being built. I do not assume that the slow ship is slow. I do not assume that the quiet crew is quiet because they have nothing to say. I do not assume that the absence of counter-surveillance behavior in the data means there is no counter-surveillance happening. Only that I have not yet identified what it looks like when a species that is better at this than we are decides to look like they are not looking. Those are the technical adjustments. They are good adjustments. They are the adjustments the sixth clade needed to make, and the Hunt Council was correct to mandate them, and they will make future observations more accurate. But the thing I carry with me, the thing that does not fit in a protocol, is simpler. It is the 4 minutes. The 4 minutes the Cash and Morn spent after the scan of Keth Ural before it turned away. 4 minutes is a specific amount of time for a specific kind of decision. It is long enough to confirm what the scan found. It is short enough that the decision was not difficult. I was assessed, in 4 minutes, with the same professional economy the Cash and Morn had applied to everything else in that corridor. The same patience, the same thoroughness, the same lack of unnecessary expenditure. I was found to be not worth the weapon. I do not say this as a complaint. I say it as the most useful piece of intelligence I possess, because it tells me something about the pale Armada that the 22 minutes does not tell me. The 22 minutes tells me what they can do, which is important, but the 4 minutes tells me what they are, which is more important. They are precise. They are economical. They do not destroy what does not require destroying. They watch, they assess, they decide, they act, and then they move on. We studied the Pale Armada for 14 years. They led us,